So this is part two. Hopefully you've watched part one. Part one, we break down the prosecutor's opening statements and the Tupac trial. Now we're going to break down the defendant's opening statements in the Tupac trial. So one of the first things that the defense counsel says is he says, when we picked a jury, we wanted to pick people who would reserve judgment until the very end. There's a reason why he says that. There's been a lot of literature written, and 80 to 90% of all jurors have their minds made up by the end of the opening statements. So he's making a plea to them to don't make up your mind like most people do at the end of the opening statements. Instead, make up your mind after you've heard everything in the case. At the very beginning of the opening statements, Mr. Michael Santh, the defense counsel, lays out the theme of their case. And what the theme of the case is, fact or fiction.
Fact or fiction.
He says what the prosecution is doing is representing things to be fact that are in fact fiction. The defense then puts up a timeline and a PowerPoint presentation to show that first it was Detective Becker who was on the case from 1996 until 2001, and then it was Detective Long that was on the case from 2002 until 2016, and then it was Detective Mogg who was on the case from 2018 to 2023. He's saying that Detective Becker began the investigation on the night of the shooting. He shows up, and at that intersection of Cobalt Ball and Flamingo, it was very, very congested. Lots of things going on. You know, a typical night in Las Vegas. And one of the things he found at the scene was cartridge cases from a .40. And potentially it was a Glock 40 that fired and left those cartridges.
Grab your blocks when you see Tupac.
Then he goes into how police, what they do, and it's very important for them to do it, is they write reports. And he says the reports are very important because 30 years later, what's Detective Becker going to look back on in order to refresh his recollection? It would be police reports, presumably, right? And he says what Detective Becker does is he kept those reports under lock and key in his own office because he didn't want any leaks coming out of the office because this is a very high profile case. And so that file wasn't maintained as files are usually maintained, but instead maintained in Detective Becker's office under lock and key. He says when Detective Becker testifies in the case, what you're going to find out is that he doesn't have police reports. They're missing. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And he said it was Metro's responsibility to make sure those reports were maintained so they could be passed on to the next detective and then passed on to the next detective. But that didn't happen. He goes on to say that Detective Becker did not trust Compton PD because Reggie Wright Sr. was the lieutenant for the Compton gang unit. Like father, like son, Reggie Wright Jr. was also a member of the Compton PD for 5 years or so, before he became head of security for Death Row Records. And he says that Reggie Wright was in charge of that same security that was in Las Vegas on the night of the shooting, the security for Death Row Records, that security that was affiliated with Mob Piru. And he says that Detectives Ladd and Brennan answered to Reggie Wright Sr. He says that Becker didn't trust Compton PD because he thought that they got their information from unreliable sources. So in 2000, Compton PD was shut down due to internal corruption, and those duties were absorbed by the greater LA PD. And so he says, let's look at the facts as Detective Becker found them. And he stresses facts. Remember, the theme is facts or fiction.
Fact or fiction.
And so he says, it's a fact that Tupac was shot multiple times. It's a fact that he was shot with a .40 caliber handgun. It's a fact that he was shot at or near the intersection of Koval and Flamingo. He says it's a fact that it occurred at or about 11:17 p.m. He said it's a fact that he was shot while he was in Suge Knight's car. He says it's also a fact that Tupac died 6 days later. And he says none of those facts will be refuted by anyone in the courtroom during the trial. And then he immediately shifts to say, but here's one thing. There are no facts that pointed to Keefe. Wait a second. What about Keefe's own words? He says Detective Long picks up the case in 2002 and keeps it till 2007. He was on the gang unit and was one of the first to arrive on the scene of the shooting on the night of the shooting. And he wrote a report every time he did anything on the file. He conducted follow-up interviews, and he even traveled to Compton to try to find more information. He said Detective Long encountered some challenges. The case was internally hidden under a false case number to unauthorized Metro access so that people could not access it or find it easily so that there would be leaks. So they had changed this when people who were not authorized to access that file were found to have been accessing that file. So Detective Long says that he gets a call from LAPD who says, hey, we've got the gun. Then they have the gun tested and it doesn't match up. It's not the same gun that was used in the shooting. And then LAPD tells Detective Long, hey, we were just testing you to see, He says right after that this is the level of, I don't know what you want to call it, whatever that was going on between Metro, LAPD, and Compton. Detective Long said that leads were becoming scarce. It was becoming more difficult to interview witnesses. A lot of those witnesses had died. So Detective Long interviews Keefe himself in 2009. At the time, Detective Long doesn't even know that a year earlier, Keefe had spoken to a federal police task force, which included the FBI. Then he says, how's that possible? He says that LAPD was in that room in 2008 when Keefe was talking to the federal police task force, but LAPD never communicated with Metro here in Las Vegas anything about that 2008 interview. And the next point he really makes with some force here is he says that after the 2008 interview, the FBI, the gold standard for criminal investigations, they do nothing whatsoever to try to corroborate the facts that were told to them by Keefe. Well, the alleged facts told to them by Keefe. So he says that you've got Keefe's own words, but nobody has matched up Keefe's words to other facts to corroborate Keefe's words. He said, and the reason why they didn't is because they knew Keefe was just full of crap. That's a quote. And that's why they didn't try to go out and corroborate anything he said, because it was just well known that this is BS.
You thought it was, but it wasn't.
So he says Detective Long brings it to the DA's office in 2009 when he learns about 2008. And the DA's office here in Las Vegas decided, we're not going to do anything about it. He said it's not because the DA's office didn't care about Tupac's demise. He said it's because they already knew that anything coming out of Keefe's mouth was probably BS, and they could not corroborate anything out of Keefe's mouth with any other facts. So they did nothing about it. He says out of all of Detective Long's investigating, they gained zero facts whatsoever except for things maybe out of Keefe's mouth, which aren't facts. This is a quote. Then Keefe D writes a book, allegedly. Yes, he says that during the opening statement is that Keefe writes a book, allegedly. Detective Mogg, who took over for Detective Long, receives a copy of the book, Compton Street Legend, in 2019. He says, still, no charges filed. So 5 years go by, still no charges. 5 years after that book or whatever, still no charges. And so he says, then Detective Mogg goes to the court and tells the court, hey, if you let us search Keefe's home in Henderson, we'll find something to connect him to the murder. He says, what we're looking for is in his home. The thing that's going to help us solve this crime is in his home. He goes on to say they didn't find anything, and Detective Mogg never even wrote a report and placed it in the file. Detective Mogg retires in 2023 and returns to talk to the grand jury. He says that Detective Mogg never writes a report, not one time, the entire time he has the case, until he's about to go to the grand jury and talk to the grand jury, and then he writes a report, and that report includes information from 2018 all the way up to 2023. First report, he makes it looking backwards 5 years. He says Detective Mogg never does anything whatsoever to corroborate any statements that were made by Keefe. He never verified the book. He said there's all kinds of theories that have been floating around for years as to who done it, but they're focused only on Keefe. Detective Moggs not focused on any of the other theories, just Keefe. So he's saying that anything he says is very biased because he's singularly focused. Interestingly, after he retires, he goes to work for the DA's office to be an investigator of the Tupac shooting at the DA's office. And it's alleged during the opening statement by the defense that he does more work on the case when he's working for the DA's office as an independent contractor investigator than he ever did in the years that he held the file as a Metro police officer. Then he brings up again Reggie Wright Jr. He says Reggie Wright's a felon. He's a former Compton police officer. His father was the head of the Compton PD gang unit. Reggie was supposed to be protecting Suge Knight, but where was he? He was nowhere near the shooting. He ordered his security that night not to be armed. And instead of being there to protect his boss, he was just chilling at Club 662 because he was going to meet him when they showed up there. They never got there. And Reggie also ordered his people to lie to police if they spoke to police at all. In addition to all that, guess who took over Death Row Records when Suge Knight went to jail for being involved in a fight in Las Vegas, which violated his probation? He goes to jail, and yes, Reggie becomes the head of Death Row Records. He says Reggie's not the only one that the state's going to call who's an unreliable witness. He says other unreliable witnesses with criminal records and financial motivations and inconsistent statements are also going to be called by the state to prove their case. One of those people is Devontae Dirt Rock Lee. And Lee, he's been a paid informant for years. He'll do anything, he'll say anything to avoid the consequences of his own crimes. He says you're also going to learn about the disgraced LAPD officer, Greg Kading. Remember we were talking about that guy, Secret Tapes, he wrote a book, all that other stuff. He says that he stole that recording, and it was nefariously recorded, secretly recorded, and he used that to get rich, to cash in, to write the book, to do the documentary and the TV series and all that other stuff. He's a bad guy. Kading's a thief. He stole the file. And Kading, in his book, holds himself out as, I'm the one that solved the murder. He said, you're also going to learn this about Detective Kading. He was caught manipulating witnesses, and that led to a bunch of criminal cases being overturned. He starts to conclude with, what facts do you have that would corroborate anything Keefe might have said? He says there's not even any proof that Keefe D was even at the Tyson fight. He says what you're going to learn is that they're going to call a bunch of people who know that Keefe D was a known bullshitter. There's no evidence even that Keefe D was in Las Vegas at the time of the shooting. No receipts, no credit cards, nothing. There's nothing linking him to the city of Las Vegas on September 7th, 1996. He says, sure, Keefe says in his book that he was on the second row, elbow to elbow with a bunch of celebrities, dressed in his finest gear, but there's no corroborating proof that that's the truth. Keefe is a bullshitter. And he concludes by saying, hey, fact versus fiction. So what he's really saying here is that Keefe makes up a story to cash in on some story. He starts making up the story when he thinks he has some form of immunity. He sees that he doesn't get caught after he says the 2008 story. And so he says some things in 2009 thinking he's Teflon bulletproof at this point in time, and nothing happens to him then. And then he says some things on Vlad TV and other places in 2017, and nothing happens to him then. And then, hey, I've got an idea. Why don't I release a book in 2019 and cash in? Cha-ching! And so he writes a book that's full of bullshit, really no truth in that book. And then now everybody wants to use that book and all of his other statements, and those statements only, to prosecute him without having any other evidence which corroborates any of Keefe's statements. So it all boils down to this. If you believe Keefe was lying all the way up through 2023 when he was arrested, then Keefe should be found to be not guilty. But if you think Keefe was telling the truth about what happened to Tupac on that night, then Keefe should be convicted of murder. And it's going to be a tough hill for the defense to climb, because what they ultimately have to show, and they've given hints of this in the opening statement already, is that anybody that tries to corroborate anything that Keefe has said in the public domain or in private conversations that became part of the public domain, anything that Keefe said, if someone tries to corroborate that, those people are not credible witnesses, because they either belong to the corrupt LAPD, or they got these Compton connections, or like Reggie Wright Jr., he stood to gain financially by taking over death row records if something were to happen to Suge and Tupac. All right, so let's break down a couple things. The defense talks a lot about Reggie Wright Jr. and Reggie Wright Sr. Why? Because they want to raise reasonable doubt that maybe Reggie Wright Jr. was behind it. They also talk about Kading. They also talk about Lee. They talk about other people. And when he talks about them in the opening statements, he says, these people can't be trusted. They're horrible people. And so the fact and fiction, lots of things were said. He's telling you to believe some of it and don't believe some of it. Most importantly, he's saying, don't believe what my client has said in the past. Don't believe that. And don't believe anything else that anyone says about my client. Fact or fiction?
Fact or fiction?
If you haven't seen part one, click over to part one. We break down the prosecutor's side of the opening statements. So we told you this was a one part and a two part, the opening statements, prosecutors, and then the defense opening statements. But there's going to be other parts out there too. As the trial goes on, certain witnesses are going to take the stand. We're going to follow it. And then we're going to summarize for you, report to you what those witnesses may or may not have said. We'll also give you some insight as to what it all means. Stick with us. We'll be here all the way until the closing arguments and a jury returns a verdict.